Okay, welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And today we're going to be looking at Trump and his continuing attacks on the city of Los Angeles. And also, we're going to do a little mini bio of Roy Cohn and his relationship to Trump. And we're going to look at the era of McCarthyism, not the variation of it going on today, but the old school, the original McCarthyism, and how it is also, in a way, actually linked to Donald Trump. So, currently, debate rolls on regarding the Los Angeles uh, situation after President Trump on June 9th, 2025, federalized about 4,000 California National Guard members and dispatched 700 active duty Marines to secure federal buildings amid protests over ICE raids. So, this marks the first time since 1965 when Lyndon B. Johnson used the Insurrection Act in Selma to aid in desegregation efforts. Anyway, it's the first time since then that a president has overridden a governor to deploy such forces. Governor Newsom called the move unconstitutional and immediately sued in federal court, seeking a restraining order against what California terms an unlawful militarization. So the troops balk at being used as political pawns, at least in some cases. There are some military family groups, including the Secure Families Initiative and Chamberlain Network. They report that dozens of Guard members and Marines are demoralized, fearing their role has shifted from defense to domestic policing. So, someone named Sarah Strider noted that deploying military force against our own communities isn't the kind of national security we signed up for. And they're worried not just about their safety, but also about having to enforce political mandates. And this includes, of course, serving at the behest of the president rather than the behest of the Constitution and the people of the United States. So, on the ground, reality diverges from Trump's rhetoric as usual. Despite alarmist claims, Trump warned that LA might be obliterated or burned to the ground without these troops, as they're called. But most protests actually were peaceful, concentrated in a 5 block downtown zone, prompted by ICE raids targeting day laborers. The LAPD made hundreds of arrests related to violence or vandalism, launched a night curfew, and used flashbangs, rubber bullets, and tear gas. So a person might oppose those actions on their own, but the LAPD did actually release a statement, and you could go ahead and read it, but it says that they had the situation under control. Meanwhile, destruction like burned Waymo vehicles did occur, but damage remained contained. And as I have said many times, you can find some riotous behavior in a lot of different circumstances, including if somebody's sports team wins. Sometimes the fans, for whatever reason, they get overzealous and they engage in property destruction just related to sports. So the idea that it's always the end of the world or something like that is obviously being overzealous in the way that the media so often like to be. And the idea that you can look at certain images of like a car on fire and think that that is the entirety of the story. If you're doing that, then you're often falling for something because, as I've noted before, why would people be outraged by the sight of a flaming car or something like that, but not be concerned about the U.S. aid cuts that the Trump administration did, which have killed an estimated 300,000 people already due to the starvation that was caused by denying food aid to starving people. And that's just one example. Of course, there are so many others I could go with, but I think you get the idea. And if you don't believe that story, go ahead and look into it. I assure you that people have been denied food aid and medicine aid, and they will die from having those resources cut off. So you might think that there are some problems with US aid and that cutting that off was a good thing, but I think you would be misinformed because when it comes down to it, you have to get resources where you can get them from. And if it happens to be from the United States, it might be a good thing, from the perspective of somebody who cares about our national image, to be seeing the United States not just as something that attacks other countries, but at least sometimes helps them out. So they're not just like a mafia family. Like even a mob boss might give to charity sometimes. That that is something that makes an organization look more human, less evil, or what have you. So yeah, moving on. There is a legal and political firestorm, of course. California's lawsuit asserts Trump misused Title X and poses a threat to the Posse Comitatus Act, arguing that local authorities were capable of handling any unrest. These statutes limit military intervention in civilian law enforcement without governor or declaration of rebellion. So the Justice Department counters by citing legal instruments from Chief Justice Rehnquist about protecting federal assets. A judge via U.S. District Court in San Francisco will soon determine whether this unprecedented power override is lawful. And, some veterans and activists cry foul about what is happening. An emerging wave of veteran opposition, spearheaded by activists like Chris Purdy and Janessa Goldbeck, accuses Trump of authoritarian tactics and racial bias, noting similar force would not likely be used in white, conservative cities. And veterans near Camp Pendleton are preparing to educate troops on their rights and their right to resist orders they view as unlawful. Nancy Pelosi and the Congressional Black Caucus chair have questioned why Trump actively and decisively acted in LA, but not on January 6th. And they're framing it as a politically motivated double standard. And that is something that I would agree with. And you have the question of militarism versus community autonomy. So from the anarchic lens that I so often talk about, it's ironic yet again how the party of so-called law and order often validates the anarchist style critiques of power. So, from that point of view, this deployment exemplifies some dangers of state militarism. Armed forces are alien to democratic self determination, serving to suppress dissent rather than address root social issues like immigration justice, economic inequality, and community safety. The normalization of military presence reinforces a logic where state sovereignty, enforced by uniform and weapon, overrides local autonomy and popular decision making. So, as the courts weigh in and protests spread, no King's rallies are planned nationwide. This clash over federal power could redefine U.S. norms. Will military intervention and domestic dissent become routine, or will community based resistance reclaim space for non hierarchical democratic alternatives? So, if I had to break down this particular story into specific bite-sized details, it would be that there were 4,000 guard and 700 Marines deployed on January, or not January, June 9th, 2025. And it was the first state override since 1965 in the Selma, Alabama action, to which was at the time to stop desegregation and actually implement means to prevent segregation. That's what I should say there. Whoops. Count that as a blooper, I guess. And there's also a legal challenge citing Title 10, the Posse Comitatus Act. So there's also predator rhetoric versus on the ground peaceful majority, and the troop morale is low, and some families and veterans object to what is happening. So, okay, moving on to the second segment, which is what I call the peripheral poophead of the week. And as promised, it is Roy Cohn. So, who is that guy? Roy Marcus Cohn, born in 1927 and died on 1986. He rose from a privileged Bronx upbringing. His father, Albert C. Cohn, served as a New York State Supreme Court justice, and his great uncle, Joshua Lionel Cohen, co founded Lionel Corporation, which is, I believe, a toy train company. But anyway, Roy Cohn came from that background to become one of the 20th century's most notorious legal operatives. And he graduated from Columbia Law School at just 20. He immediately claimed a seat at the table of power, you might say. By May 1948, age 21, he joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, where he spearheaded prosecutions that became symbols to some of systemic repression, including cases under the Smith Act and espionage entrapments like that of William Remington. So, from the anti-authoritarian perspective, I would say these maneuvers exemplify how sometimes state law functions as a weapon to suppress dissent and enforce ideological conformity, because William Remington was to the left politically. He was targeted. And in 1951 to 1952, Cohn ascended to fame as assistant to Senator Joe McCarthy. He helped engineer the conviction and eventual execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which climaxed the Stalinist panic of the era. He then became chief counsel during the dramatic Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, America's original TV spectacle, where he aggressively attacked perceived enemies, only to be rebuffed when Senator Joseph Welch exposed the tactics as coercive and hypocritical. And nowadays, people see McCarthyism as largely a bad thing, unless you're on the far right, in which case you'll celebrate it, sometimes exaggeratedly and cartoonishly so. So, breaking with the state machinery afterwards, but not being entirely separate from it, Cohn relocated to New York City and reinvented himself in private practice. He cultivated ties with the mafia, including Salerno and Gotti, and Studio 54 figures, and even the Catholic Church, all while advising a young Donald Trump. So, Trump credited Cohn with teaching him to never admit you're wrong, counterattack viciously, and confuse opponents. So these strategies, they actually reflect the anarchic critiques of legalized power as pure domination, using public opinion, coercion, and legal labyrinths to silence adversaries. Shit. Despite surviving indictments for extortion, bribery, and conspiracy, often via acquittal, Cohn's abuses eventually caught up with him. In 1986, he was disbarred for forging a will while a client lay incapacitated, misappropriating funds, and lying on bar applications. A five-judge appellate court ruled that forcing a pen into the hand of the semi-conscious multimillionaire Louis Rosenstiel to insert himself into a will was inexcusable. So imagine a con artist being in Trump's orbit. That seems that seems highly unlikely, wink wink. So just 6 weeks later, he died at 59 from AIDS related complications, though he insisted to the end it was actually liver cancer. But this is where we get into his closet history a little bit. He was gay, yet led anti LGBTQ campaigns, including opposing New York City civil rights ordinances. And this exposes deep hypocrisy. And from the dreaded anarchic standpoint, the irony really demonstrates how coercive legal structures enforce norms that destroy individuals while claiming moral high ground. So Cohn's legacy is something we're still grappling with. Roger Stone and Trump institutionalized his tactics in U.S. politics, embracing relentless personal attacks over any transparent dialogue. And the 2019 documentary, Where's My Roy Cohn, portrays him as evil, produced by certain parts of American culture, and it's emblematic of a winner takes all ethos born in Reagan era individualism. So, Roy Cohn illustrates the law's role as a state protection racket in many respects, sealing privilege for the powerful while disciplining the weak, repressing dissenters, and reinforcing hierarchies. His career highlights how legal authority is not neutral but ideological and a tool of domination, not justice, at least in a lot of different cases. There are exceptions to that, but in a lot of cases, I think that is represented by the Roy Cohn story. So, Cohn's journey from child prodigy of sorts and anti communist prosecutor to corrupt fixer and closeted demon reveals how state and legal institutions so often protect elite networks and crush dissent. His life reflects the anarchist critiques. You know, they validate the talking points of those who we're supposed to despise the most. You know, the critique that law legitimizes oppression, bolsters hierarchies, and masks violence through rituals of authority. So, understanding Cohn is understanding how power anonymizes itself under legality, driving a deeper call to dismantle such corruption and in favor of true freedom. And these people, they so often say, "Oh, I'm all about freedom." Yet, it obviously Roy Cohn was himself forced into the closet. He couldn't even admit, the very basic nature of who he was. So it's yet another example of that dynamic. So this brings me to the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. None other than Joseph McCarthy. I almost said none other. I guess maybe it was either my Euperism sneaking out, or maybe I was thinking none utter Joseph McCarthy's name, or if you say it too often, maybe he'll appear sort of like Candyman and take you to task and ask you about your communist leanings or something like that. But anyway, none other than Joseph McCarthy is who we are looking at today. And this is partly because Cohn was Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel during the McCarthy hearings in 1954. So, those are the biggest scandal involving Joseph McCarthy, of course, the McCarthy hearings, sort of what he's famous for. It's the most notorious scandal tied to Joe McCarthy, and his role in the Red Scare during the early 1950s is well known, particularly the wave of accusations and investigations he led in the name of rooting out communists in the US government, in military, and in media, as well as presumably many other possible institutions and job locations. This period, known as McCarthyism, peaked with the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, which publicly exposed his reckless and often evidence free tactics. Although, of course, those sort of tactics prevail even today. And one of the long standing tactics to use against anybody who's even marginally leftist is to claim that they are communistic today. That's still being used. And it works very much the same way that, the critics of the anti war people um, were employing it in the Gulf War era. The Bush's second invasion of Iraq. They were saying that you were supporting Saddam Hussein, you were with the terrorists, etc. It's really the same thing in principle as saying that they were just communists or whatever. It works very much in the same way. And the hearings in question were nationally televised and marked the turning point in McCarthy's downfall when attorney Joseph Welch famously challenged McCarthy with the rebuke, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" The public began to see McCarthy not as a patriot, but as a bully abusing his power. So shortly after, the Senate voted to censure McCarthy, which sort of ended his influence. So, from the dreaded anarchic perspective, the anarchic lens, uh, McCarthyism is a textbook example or case of state repression and manufactured fear used to consolidate power and suppress dissent. So, one of the key points of the anarchist critique of power is that state power will run amok if you let it. So McCarthy's crusade was enabled by centralized state authority, particularly through congressional committees and surveillance organs like the FBI. To the wicked anarchists out there, this reveals how easily power structures turn paranoid and authoritarian when left unchecked. And there were witch hunts against thought crimes, essentially. People were persecuted not for actions but for beliefs, often alleged or suspected ones. And this aligns with the anarchist critique of the state's desire to control not just behavior but ideology. Freedom of association and expression were trashed in the name of security. And there was the weaponization of fear. McCarthyism thrived on creating a culture of fear, of communism, of the other, of betrayals. So keep in mind, as I bring this up, that one of the key talking points against the civil rights was that all of the civil rights activists, including MLK himself, were communists. They were saying that desegregation is a way of implementing communism. So that was one of the arguments that they regularly made. And based partly on things like that, the radical, the radical anarchist types who would also be called communists see this as a classic tool of hierarchical power, keep people afraid, and you can justify almost any repression. And that included, of course, segregation. And there were also elements of the corporate state alliance at work here. Many people blacklisted during this time were in Hollywood, academia, or labor unions, places where leftist or progressive politics were growing or where people feared they might grow. Because if workers are getting screwed over, they might start, challenging their workplaces. And the capitalist types don't want that. So anarchists would point to this as collusion between the state and capitalist institutions to destroy emerging counter narratives. Anybody who wants more of a say in how their workplace functions, well, you could just say that they were communists and, maybe threaten them with jail time just based on what they ostensibly believe, even if they weren't actually communists, of course. Even if they practically had no radical bones in their body, the very fact that they were challenging, the business class in any sense would have them conveniently smeared as being communists. So you have suppression of grassroots movements ultimately. McCarthyism didn't just target Soviet sympathizers, it broadly attacked labor organizers, civil rights activists, and, yes, radicals of all kinds as well. So, from the anarchist standpoint, this was a full on assault on grassroots efforts to redistribute power or challenge any capitalist norms. And like I've tried to imply here or strongly suggest, um, alternately, the uh, the challenging of the capitalist norms, that's not just something you do because you read up on Marx or whatever. You don't have to be a radical to question the nature of the world around you. That's called having a brain, right? Now, sometimes the conclusions you reach might actually align with some traditional radical views, but that might just be a coincidence. You might not even have read any radical literature or anything like that. It might just seem like common sense that, hey, I'm being screwed over by my workplace. Maybe I should organize with, these people who have my back and actually, try to gain more rights, more money, more compensation, more this, more that. And that's why we have things like, limited hours in a work week, and we've got the conventionally the 40-hour work week. People. I mean, at some point, it was the norm that people would send their kids to work in factories or in mines or whatever. But in the United States, the labor movement actually won some rights, and one of those was the general standard that, hey, maybe kids should not be working in these dangerous jobs and whatnot. So yeah, people who really don't want the workers to have rights, they will latch on to a lot of anti-communist rhetoric to help make sure that they stay in their place. So the bottom line is that McCarthy's scandal wasn't just about one man's overreach. It was a revealing moment when the US government exposed its willingness to crush opposition, centralize control, and weaponize paranoia to maintain the status quo. So it's a case study in why hierarchical systems, especially state based ones, can never be trusted with the power to define truth or justice. And I think that's something we're finding right now today.